Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer lore. Today, we are going to have a look at the kingdom of Ind. Because after looking at Nippon, of course, it is only natural that I'd cover the other two lesser-known areas as well. And Ind, in particular, is a very fascinating little place, particularly in the Warhammer universe and in relations to how chaos functions. But before we get into that, let's look a little bit about the general information about Ind. Ind is not so much a single nation as the continent upon which several smaller human nations, and some other nations as well, exist. They do have kind of an overarching rulership in a sense, but it's nothing like the rigidly defined social order of the Empire, in which the Emperor is the highest authority, under him is the elected council, and so on and so on and so on. In Ind, rulership is far more of a fluid term. You see, the various human settlements in Ind are surrounded by vast stretches of jungle, inside of which lives all manners of horrifying creatures, both in an organized fashion and just good old-fashioned roaming monsters. It could kind of be compared to the early days of the Empire. As we all probably know at this point, the Empire has vast swathes of forests, in which lives all manners of unpleasant creatures. But in the Empire, considerable portions of these forests have, to one degree or another, been tamed. At least, relatively speaking, meaning that you can trade and travel fairly safely between the major settlements, and you'll only need a small to medium-sized escort to make sure you can get through some of the feistier areas. In Ind, however, this taming of the land never really happened due to a variety of factors, but it is a far wilder, and as a consequence, considerably more dangerous place, where the various human settlements have to constantly compete not only with one another, but also the various denizens of the jungle. This means that when one local warlord rises, be he of a human kind or something completely different, the sheer hostility of the terrain and the various creatures that live within it means that he is extremely unlikely to gain dominance over more than a small portion of the overall continent. And that, of course, is assuming that there is anybody out there who would actually want control over the whole continent. Ind is in a rather peculiar position, where society is often dominated by merchants and traders. This is due to the fact that Ind possesses vast quantities of valuable, exotic, and rare resources. Spice, gold, silk, silver, and all manners of pretty doodads highly valued by the various other races of the Warhammer world. And to give you an indication of just how highly prized some of these scarce and highly valued resources are, in Ind, metal money, the likes of copper, silver, and gold, is considered to be a most base form of currency, a tertiary monetary system at best, traded in by the lower castes, the plebeians, the filthy casuals, whilst the true nobles of Ind trade using tokens carved into various fanciful shapes of beasts, gods, and animals made out of jade and ivory. But of course, even an infinite access to the rarest of resources is worth absolutely nothing unless you have a means of transporting those resources to the people willing to pay for them. And in this respect too, Ind is uniquely placed to distribute their various knickknacks to the wider world. As Ind was originally considered essentially one big, massive trade port for the High Elves. During their period of greatness, they founded several vast and impressive cities in which the human population of Ind now dwell. These cities, conceived, designed, and built at a height of elven power, include vast harbour complexes that are now utilized by the people of Ind to ship their exotic goods across the globe, finding willing markets practically wherever they go. Not just in Ulthuan, but in Bretonnia, the Empire, Marienburg, Cathay, Nippon, and everywhere else. This booming trade has led the merchants and traders of Ind to become fantastic fantastically wealthy, growing up to be the de facto noble class of the Indian continent. And it is hard to overstate the degree of wealth of which we are talking about here. Whilst the various rich and powerful men in the empire might splurge and show their wealth by patronizing sculptures or artists, the rich and powerful of Ind patronized the constructions of entire temples crafted from the purest gold. And of course, the raising of ever more lavish temples is not the only shape that competition between the various merchants, guilds, and traders manifest. As you can probably imagine, inside of a society where everybody is competing for a vast pot of gold, competition tends to get rather vicious. There is absolutely nothing the various merchants will not do, that they will not trade in, or that they will not trade with to further their own goals. Be it business relationships with Norscan raiders with a penchant for attacking their competition, or by trading in various extremely unhealthy drugs, and perhaps the trade in livelier goods, like vast quantities of slaves, both alive and occasionally in a less lively state. As mentioned, there are many temples in Ind, and there are many gods as well to occupy said temples, some of which are less than entirely pleasant. You see, another name for Ind is the Land of 1,000 Gods, and that, if anything, is an understatement. The various people of Ind, the vast majority of which are not the rich merchant classes, but rather dirt-poor peasants, are fanatically superstitious. They worship and pray to practically everything. Strands of grass, little field mice, cows, cats, dogs, bridges, roads, meat, whatever you can think of, there's probably a religion around it somewhere in Ind. This is of course also where things get really interesting. A fair bit of this stuff might simply just inconvenience the local traders coming from the Empire, like for example getting yelled at for walking on the wrong side of a street during a certain holiday, or eating a specific animal in public, or peeing in the incorrect place. Confusing and mildly annoying for the poor bastard whom it affects, but nothing else. Like in our world, if you go to a place with strange customs and all manners of foreign rites, you might be very confused about the locals' habits of praying to field mice. However, this is Warhammer, a universe in which feelings and beliefs turn into actual godlike entities in the warp. Now, as previously mentioned, the sheer amount of worship, of belief, of emotions, etc. determine how self-aware and powerful the deity is. This, of course, results in a very great and diverse range of potentially powerful deities. An example I used once previously is that of a small village. In this village, they believe in the god Burblebob. He makes milk curdle. That is all that Burblebob does. He makes milk curdle. And assuming that the entire village of, say, some 150-odd people believe in Burblebob, that might actually create a demonic entity in the warp called Burblebob. Burblebob will have far too little power and self-awareness to really know what he is, or why he exists, or anything like that. All he knows is that he doesn't like milk and wants to curdle it. And he only wants to curdle it in this specific geographical area. Hell, he's probably only going to be curdling milk that belongs specifically to this village. And if the village has also then decided that they can thwart Burblebob's effort by placing a small piece of hedgehog poop on top of their milk buckets, then Burblebob will see the hedgehog poop and recoil in fear, because that is how they think he will react. Now imagine thousands of Burblebobs, all scattered over a massive Indian subcontinent, all doing different things, and with hundreds of thousands of people all believing that Burblebob does slightly different things, in slightly different ways, in slightly different regions. It's a bit of an oversimplification to be sure, but the net result is the same. You now have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of distinct warp entities, each with their own pieces of lore and reasons for acting in the way they do, all competing with one another for the feelings, emotions, and belief of these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And since we also know that all warp entities will on an instinctual level try to acquire more food for themselves, in other words, they will try to encourage more of the emotions, the beliefs, and the feelings that they feed on in the people they can affect, that now means that we have, again, tens of thousands of warp entities all competing with another to influence the minds of these people. There is little wonder that the people of Ind can seem somewhat confused and scattershot toward the casual observer, seeing as they are currently being quite literally influenced by thousands of deities. And remember, once again, this is the Warhammer universe. They don't merely believe in these thousands of deities that can't really affect them. All of these various mini-gods can and will do what they have been dreamt up to do in such a way as to try and affect the people around them. For the people of Ind, praying to, satisfying, and following the various religious rites of all of these thousands of deities is not merely a thing that they observe out of habit, it can actually be a life or death question for them. Because if you piss off one deity because you didn't pay him the correct amount of respect, because you were busy paying respect to another deity, then that deity might very well send a landslide in your general direction, or make your house collapse, or curdle your milk. Again, depending on the power of the deity. Nevertheless, this is so fascinating to me, and I wish that Games Workshop would have looked more at Ind, because this seems as if you followed the logic of the Liber Chaotica, that the entire subcontinent would basically be one gargantuan fucking minefield, filled with thousands of competing deities that will all try to fuck with one another and, of course, their followers, whether or not you be an avowed follower or merely an incidental follower, which you kind of have to be for your own safety. Oh boy, that has to be one interesting goddamn place to live in. And another really fascinating thing is, listening to all of this, you might think that Ind would be completely overrun with chaos, since there are literally thousands of chaotic entities operating in Ind. However, you would be wrong. You see, the exact same logic applies. If you have 1,000 different entities, all encouraging their own actions and belief sets, you will then have 1,000 different competing lifestyles, views, and ways of worship. This will in turn mean that every single deity will have less power in wider society, since it will only be receiving a fraction of the overall potential power. Now, of course, for some larger entities, they will be able to draw power from multiple sources. For example, there might be half a dozen different minor deities that are related to corn in Ind, all of which are essentially corn in disguise. So whenever anybody makes any obeisances to one of these minor gods, that would also feed into corn. But again, even if each of the 4 major chaos gods had dozens of mini deities, they would still only make up a minority of the total amount of gods worshipped, which in return would considerably limit their influence. And, of course, whilst all deities are warp entities, that does not mean that they are chaotic entities. Considering how remarkably unstable a place that Ind has to be with all of these thousands of deities all running around doing their own things, a considerable portion of those gods would probably be gods of protection. Protection against natural disasters, landslides, earthquakes, against raiding from the Dark Elves, against the beastmen, against all kinds of natural and unnatural happenstances. Naturally, these deities would also be amongst some of the most powerful, since from a simple reason of self-preservation, a lot of people would want to pray to them so as to not get fucked with by all of the other deities. They're basically like the warp-born mafia, receiving protection money in return for making sure that nothing bad happens to your house. And bearing in mind that these protection deities, just like all of the other deities, will instinctively be attempting to increase their own power, they will certainly be making this offer of protection whilst holding a very large rock and casting furtive glances at your unbroken windows. Considering this somewhat antagonistic relationship between the population and their deities, it's a small wonder that the merchant classes pour so much money into temples. Oh, and by the way, I did mention beastmen, didn't I? Although, I am not entirely sure that these are what you would normally refer to as beastmen. When we say beastmen, we think of the ones in the old world, uncultured savages that worship chaos in its most primal, pure form. They are not just worshippers of chaos, they are a direct product of chaos. This is one of the reasons why they look the way they do. In the common perception of the imperial or Bretonnian peasant, the devil, something evil, is something misshapen, something bestial, something with cloven hooves and the head of a great bull. The beastmen, being products of chaos, were shaped just like chaos itself is shaped by the population in which it exists. If the population is afraid of creatures with cloven hooves and great bullish heads, then the beastmen are going to be creatures with great bullish heads and cloven hooves. This also appears to be the same case in Ind, where there are beastmen tribes, indeed even apparently organized into proper tribal societies. Now, that may immediately ring some warning bells, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. The beastmen appear to be functioning on the same basic rules as the beastmen in the Empire, except of course slightly different. In Ind, the population isn't afraid of cloven-hooved creatures with bullish heads. Instead, they're afraid of things like the great tigers that prowl the jungles, or the massive crocodiles that prowl the rivers. Thusly, the beastmen have the heads of great tigers or big-ass crocodiles. However, that is where the similarities end. The beastmen in Ind vary from those in the Empire on one very fundamental and potentially very defining factor that might mean that the Ind beastmen are not actually beastmen at all. The first piece of interesting evidence that they might not be quite as closely related to their Western cousins as at first suspected is the fact that the locals treat them with a mixture of reverence and worship. They view them potentially as gods themselves, and at the very least as avatars of their gods. Now, in the case of the Western beastmen, that would be, well, precisely correct. However, there is a small difference. In the case of the beastmen in the Empire, they, at the absolute most, tolerate other worshippers of the same gods. They don't like them, they don't view their cooperation with them as any form of alliance, they simply see them as means to an end. Retarded tools that, at the end of the day, will be complicit in their own destruction. And as for any other human, or indeed any other race, that doesn't follow chaos, they treat them with nothing short of absolute hatred. The beastmen of Ind, however, have a rather different modus operandi. In Ind, the general human population might offer up certain tributes to the beastmen living in the deeper jungles. Food, drink, this kind of stuff, or perhaps luxury goods. In return, the beastmen will not viciously murder them. They might even show mercy to travelers caught on the road should they belong to a certain community that the beastmen favor. Indeed, there is a short story about an Empire merchant who is traveling with a bunch of local guides. Once the group is attacked by a small band of beastmen, the guides simply just bow down and start praying. The Imperial merchant and his bodyguards do manage to fight off the beastmen, and of course are somewhat confused by the fact that their human bearers just decided to bow down and apparently accept their inevitable devouring at the hands of the beastmen. Because of course, in the minds of anybody who lives in the Empire, beastmen are mindless savages, whilst in this case, for the bearers to simply just throw down their lot and start praying, they would have to have had, at the very least, a reasonable expectation of surviving. Religion does a lot of strange stuff to people, but generally speaking, self-preservation usually takes precedence. This shows a certain level of restraint on behalf of the beastmen that their Western cousins would probably not be able to emulate. Now, it is possible that they now view these human peoples as also de facto followers of their gods, since they at the very least show them the proper respect and possibly also offerings, but whilst that is plausible, I think it would be a bit of a stretch. In particular, when you see this piece of artwork. This really is the clincher for me. This is from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, Tomes of Corruption, and shows an Eastern beastman, one of Ind with a tiger's head, probably one of the Bengal tribe. Immediately, several things become very, very obvious indeed if you have any knowledge at all about the beastman. Firstly, look at his weapon. That is not a crudely forged hunk of metal. It even has inscriptions in some form of language on it. Additionally, it does not appear to simply be a looted weapon. Look at the haft. It seems to fit in the beastman's hands perfectly, as if designed specifically for that kind of hand structure and size. You can see the pommel there arriving just beneath the second hand on the two-handed grip. The pommel also has further decorations on it. A weapon like this would be far beyond both the capabilities and the patience of Western beastmen to create. In most cases, the beastmen of the Empire use crudely hammered weapons, large axes, or broad-bladed swords, alternatively anything and everything they can loot from Imperial villages. In other words, the exact opposite of this relatively finely crafted weapon. And then secondly, look at his clothes, and the fact that he is actually wearing clothes. The beastmen of the Empire view their form as the true form of chaos. They consider themselves the only true children and followers of chaos. They would consider any form of embellishment upon that form, wearing what appears to be fine silks and furs, to be downright heretical, as it would mean that they would be covering up their own true form, the form of their gods, with the products of the impure humans. Again, you have to remember, the beastmen are pure creatures of chaos. They consider themselves to be the only proper chaotic creatures, and they take incredible pride in this. And as an extension of that, they have nothing but disdain for anything ordered or organized. Craftsmanship, for example, that is a representation of order, and craftsmanship specifically designed to show off social status, like for example jewelry, is even worse, since that, of course, is the product of a stable, organized society. Let me give you an example of just how much they fucking loathe anything even remotely ordered. It took one of the most skilled and charismatic individuals in the entirety of beastman history just to convince them to utilize ladders when attacking an enemy fortification. That is how much they hate anything that might even remotely resemble craftsmanship or order. And yet, here we have a creature that is clearly part beast, carrying a finely forged weapon with intricate inscriptions on it, none of which appear to be overly chaotical, wearing what appears to be silken or at the very least cotton clothing, with fur trims and embellishment, and also what appears to be a golden necklace around his neck. This creature is about as diametrically opposed to the common image of a beastman in the Empire as it's possible to get. Additionally, they apparently organize into semi-organized societies known as tribes, as the example of the Bengal tribe being a group exclusively made up of beastmen with the heads of tigers. Again, the beastmen in the Empire don't really form tribes. They form herds. Usually these are groups of beastmen gathered up for a specific purpose, or organized by a Bray shaman that has been given a mission by the gods, or simply just drunk too much fungal juice, or have been organized by a particularly powerful war leader, again, usually with a relatively specific objective, like raiding this particular village, attacking this particular convoy, stuff like that. And after this objective has been completed, the herd will usually, unless the leader in charge is particularly charismatic and powerful, simply just scatter back into the wilderness and look for another mission and another leader. In the case of the beastmen of Ind, however, not only do they appear to have organized into a fairly permanent tribe, they've also selected a specific ruin, a specific area within the jungle, to build what looks frighteningly much like an actual society. They might be beastmen in the sense that they have the bodies of men and the head of beasts, but whether or not they are beastmen in the strictest meaning of the word, I have my reservations about that. Now, let us pivot rather abruptly away from the idea of furries lurking in the forest with very large swords, and instead get on the topic of elves bleeding from their vaginas. And no, unfortunately, that's not a euphemism. Once every decade, the everqueen goes on a pilgrimage of sorts. Along with her, to ensure her safety, goes the entirety of the High Elf Royal Fleet, along with entire armies of troops sworn to her service, and dozens upon dozens of dragons. It is quite the overpowering procession. But considering they're going to have to make it all the way from Ulthuan to the Tower of the Sun, fighting their way through, to put it rather mildly, hostile seas, and then miles upon miles of jungles infested with all manners of hostile creatures, animals, and 6-armed monkeys? Yes. Right, okay then. And those, to finally reach the Tower of the Sun, where the everqueen will squat down and present her menstrual blood to whoever may be concerned, and by doing this, she will stop the literal moon, Morslib, from crashing into the planet and destroying the Earth. Unappetizing as that particular method may sound, I have to admit it is definitely the most unusual MacGuffin I have ever heard of, whose role is to prevent the destruction of the planet. So that's a gold star for ingenuity to whoever came up with that, but at the same time, you probably should go see a head doctor. I'm just saying, something's wrong with you. That's all. And I think that is just the perfect note upon which to end this video. Just perfect. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and may you all have a bloodless day.